Greek gods were powerful, but they lied, cheated, got jealous, fell in love, made mistakes, and fought constantly, like humans. This wasn't a flaw. It was the entire point. Today, we're going to explore why the ancient Greeks designed the gods this way, why these stories mattered, and why mythology that looks chaotic actually reflects something deeply human. No overdrama. Just a clear, simple explanation. 1. Gods were mirrors, not models. When we picture gods today, we often think of perfect beings, entities beyond flaws and weaknesses. But for the ancient Greeks, gods weren't moral authorities. They were mirrors. The Greeks lived in a world filled with uncertainty, earthquakes, storms, illness, war, unpredictable harvests. Life wasn't neat or fair. It was messy, emotional, and sometimes cruel. So their gods reflected that, not to confuse people, but to make the world feel understandable. A god who acted perfectly would have felt distant. A god who got angry, fell in love, or made poor decisions. That was familiar. The Greeks weren't trying to imagine a flawless universe. They were trying to make sense of the one they lived in. 2. Human emotion was the language people understood. Before formal psychology, before science, mythology was the human way of explaining emotion. Zeus wasn't just a sky god. He was the embodiment of power, desire, impulse, and authority. Hera wasn't only a queen of heaven. She represented jealousy, loyalty, and the struggle to maintain dignity in a world full of betrayal. Aphrodite was beauty and desire personified. Ares was rage walking in human form. Athena was strategy and intelligence turned into a character. Every god was a human feeling made visible. The ancient Greeks didn't separate the divine from the emotional. For them, emotions were divine forces. And to understand the gods, you had to understand yourself. 3. Myths explained the chaos of life. Imagine you're an ancient farmer. The sky suddenly fills with thunder. You don't have meteorology. You don't know about atmospheric pressure or lightning conductivity. But you do know stories. Zeus is angry. Something in the world is off balance. This is how you connect cause and effect. The stories gave shape to chaos. They made unpredictable things feel personal, understandable, even meaningful. The gods acted like humans because the world acted like humans. Unpredictable, emotional, and sometimes irrational. The myths allowed people to say, I don't understand what's happening, but at least I understand the story. 4. Myths were never meant to be perfect religious rules. Unlike later religions with strict scriptures, Greek mythology wasn't a rulebook. There wasn't a single correct version of a story. There were dozens, sometimes hundreds. Different cities had different versions. Different poets told the myths differently. Even the gods changed personalities depending on the storyteller. This flexibility meant that the myths weren't about divine perfection. They were about exploring ideas. A story where Zeus cheats isn't meant to encourage cheating. A story where Hera seeks revenge isn't meant to praise vengeance. These stories were dramatic metaphors, ways of thinking out loud. Mythology wasn't a sacred law. It was a conversation, a cultural discussion about what it means to be human. 5. Flawed gods made the stories more useful. The Greeks didn't want moral perfection. They wanted guidance. A perfect god can't teach you how to deal with anger. A perfect god can't teach you how to resist temptation. A perfect god can't show you what goes wrong when someone abuses power. But Zeus? He shows what unchecked authority looks like. Hera? She shows how jealousy can spiral. Aphrodite? She shows how desire can control you. Ares? He shows how rage can cloud judgment. Athena? She shows how intelligence and strategy can overcome raw strength. By making the gods flawed, the Greeks turned divine beings into teaching tools. Not instructors, but examples, warnings, reflections. A story about a perfect being teaches nothing. A story about a flawed one teaches everything. 6. Ancient people didn't separate myth from reality the way we do. Today, we think in categories. religion versus science, fact versus fiction, myth versus history, literal versus symbolic. But the Greeks didn't draw those lines. To them, a myth could be metaphorical and true at the same time. Homer wasn't trying to convince you that every detail literally happened. Hesiod wasn't writing a scientific creation theory. Myths were stories that felt true, even if they weren't literal. The gods could be real as symbols, real as characters, and real as psychological truths, without being real as physical beings. This is why their flaws didn't bother ancient listeners. Because the goal wasn't accuracy. The goal was meaning. 7. The gods represented the full range of human behavior. Each god represented a piece of human experience. And because humans are contradictory, the gods were contradictory too. Zeus could be wise in one myth, careless in another. Poseidon could be nurturing towards sailors or violently destructive. Artemis could protect the young or strike someone down for disrespect. The Greeks didn't see these contradictions as mistakes. They saw them as honest. Humans aren't consistent. Emotions aren't consistent. The world isn't consistent. A flawless god would have felt fake. A human-like god felt true. 8. Mythology was entertainment and education. Let's be honest. These stories were fun. Drama, romance, betrayal, adventure, war, monsters, quests. The myths were the movies, novels, and television of the ancient world. People gathered to hear them. Poets performed them. Cities hosted festivals for them. But entertainment wasn't the end goal. The drama kept people listening. The lessons were embedded inside. Like a good story that leaves you thinking long after it ends, Greek myths stayed in the mind. A flawed god was more interesting. And because they were interesting, they stayed alive across generations. A perfect god might end the story. A flawed god keeps it going. 9. The myths reflected Greek society itself. Greek culture valued debate, argument, and challenging ideas. Their gods argue constantly. Their heroes question commands. Their myths explore disputes, dilemmas, and gray areas. This mirrors Greek society. Athenians debated philosophy. Spartans debated honor and strength. Poets debated ethics. Philosophers debated everything. So their myths weren't answers. They were questions. Why do humans suffer? What is justice? What makes a good leader? How should you treat your family? What happens when desire overpowers reason? What does it mean to be wise? Every myth invited discussion, not obedience. 10. Even heroes reflected human struggle. Look at the most famous Greek heroes. Achilles wasn't noble. He was proud and emotional. Odysseus wasn't pure. He was cunning and sometimes deceptive. Hercules wasn't stable. He struggled with rage and impulsivity. Perseus wasn't invincible. He needed help from the gods. Greek heroes weren't moral paragons. They were flawed humans pushed to extremes. This allowed listeners to see themselves inside the stories. A perfect hero is impossible to relate to. A flawed hero? That feels real. That feels achievable. This is the same reason the gods were human-like. Because the myths weren't about perfect beings. They were about the human experience. 11. Myths were teaching tools about consequences. When Zeus acted impulsively, things went wrong. When Hera acted out of jealousy, others suffered. When Ares acted out of anger, battles became bloodier. When mortals disrespected the gods, tragedy followed. Not because the gods were moral judges, but because the stories were exploring cause and effect. You could learn how your actions affect others by watching the gods do the same things at a cosmic scale. Instead of commandments, the Greeks used examples. Instead of laws, they used narratives. People weren't told what to believe. They were shown what might happen. 12. The final idea. The gods were human because the stories were human. So why did the Greek gods act so human? Because they weren't meant to be divine perfection. They were storytelling devices, psychological symbols, reflections of emotion, explanations for nature, teaching tools, and mirrors of the human soul. The myths survived for thousands of years not because the gods were flawless, but because the gods were familiar. They made people feel understood. They made the world feel less chaotic. And they turned human nature into stories that still feel meaningful today. Greek gods acted like humans. Because the stories were never about gods. They were always about us. If you enjoyed this breakdown, follow for more simple, clear explanations of ancient history, psychology, and mythology. No overdrama. Just stories that make sense.